This content presents World War II historical events for educational purposes only, based on documented records to honor those who served and provide historical insight. This does not glorify violence, promote hatred, or spread misinformation. Viewer discretion advised.
The metal of the rifle felt colder than it should have in the November heat. I remember thinking that as we stood packed like sardines in the belly of that transport ship, somewhere off the coast of Morocco. The year was 1942, and none of us really understood what we were sailing toward. We were just boys, most of us, who'd signed up thinking war was something glorious, something you saw in newsreels, with triumphant music playing over footage of tanks rolling through foreign streets. But standing there in the dark hold of that vessel, listening to the waves crash against the hull, and feeling the ship rise and fall with each swell, glory seemed like a word from another language. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the scent of innocence burning away with each nautical mile that brought us closer to Africa. I clutched my rifle tighter, not because I was ready to use it, but because it was the only solid thing in a world that had started to feel like it was made of water and uncertainty. My hands had been shaking for 3 days straight. I tried to hide it from the other men, keeping my fingers wrapped around the rifle or shoved deep in my pockets when I had the chance. Jenkins, a kid from Nebraska with freckles that made him look even younger than his 19 years, caught me once and just nodded. He didn't say anything, but I saw his hands trembling too when he lit a cigarette that night on deck. We were supposed to smoke. The officer said the light could give away our position to enemy. Jenkins lit it anyway, cupping the flame like it was something sacred. The orange glow illuminated his face for just a moment, and I saw everything I felt reflected there. The terror, the homesickness, the desperate wish that we could turn this whole armada around and sail back to a world that made sense. But we couldn't. Of course, history had already decided where we were going, even if we didn't know it yet. The briefing had been short and confusing. Operation Torch. They called it like we were bringing light to some dark corner of the world. We were going to land on the beaches of North Africa, secure the ports, and push inland. The officers talked about strategic objectives and supply lines, about Vichy French forces, and the importance of establishing a foothold against Ramos' Africa Corps. But all I could think about was my mother's kitchen back in Ohio, the way sunlight would stream through the window above the sink on Sunday mornings, and how she'd hum while making breakfast. I had written her a letter the night before we shipped out, but I couldn't bring myself to seal it. What do you say when you don't know if you'll ever see someone again? I told her about the weather, about the friends I'd made, about how the food wasn't as bad as everyone said. I didn't tell her that I was terrified. I didn't tell her that I'd wake up every night in a cold sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I just signed it your loving son and left it with the chaplain to mail. If something happened to me the night before the landing, nobody slept. We lay in our bunks, staring at the metal ceiling or the back of someone else's head, each of us alone with our thoughts, even though we were crammed together shoulder to shoulder. Someone was praying in Spanish, the words a soft murmur that rose and fell like the waves outside. Someone else was crying quietly, trying to muffle the sound with his blanket. I wanted to cry too, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt this strange hollowness, like I'd already become a ghost and just didn't know it yet. I thought about Emily, the girl I'd left behind. Wondered if she was thinking about me, or if she'd already moved on to someone else. Someone who was about to storm a beach in a country he'd never heard of before enlisting. I'd promised her I'd come back, promised her we'd get married in the little church on Maple Street. But lying there in the dark, listening to the ship groan and the men around me wrestle with their own demons, I wondered if promises meant anything anymore. When the order finally came to gear up, there was almost a sense of relief. The waiting had been worse than anything we were about to face, or at least that's what we told ourselves. We strapped on our equipment with fingers made clumsy by adrenaline and fear, checking and rechecking our weapons, our ammunition, our canteens. The sergeant walked down the line, his face a mask of forced confidence, telling us we were ready, that we'd trained for this, that we were the finest fighting force the world had ever seen. But I saw the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was looking, saw the white-knuckled grip he had on his own rifle. We were all pretending, every last one of us, acting out roles in a play we didn't want to be in. And as the engines changed pitch, and we felt the ship begin to turn toward shore, I realized that this was the moment that would divide my life into before and after, if there was going to be an after at all. The landing craft hit the water with a crash that knocked half of us off our feet. I scrambled to grab onto the man next to me, Peterson, a quiet guy from Minnesota who never talked about his family, and we held each other up as the small boat began its journey toward the beach. Through the gaps in the metal ramp at the front, I could see the sky beginning to lighten, that strange purple-gray color that comes just before dawn. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think was that we were going to die in daylight, that whatever happened next was going to happen where everyone could see it. The boat pitched and rolled, and I tasted bile at the back of my throat. Around me, men were getting sick, the sound and smell mixing with the diesel fumes and salt spray. No one made jokes about it. We were too far gone for jokes. The shore looked peaceful from a distance, just a dark line separating water from sky. But as we got closer, I could make out detailed palm trees, white buildings, a lighthouse standing like a silent sentinel over the harbor. For a moment, my mind played tricks on me, and I imagined this was just a vacation, that we'd land on that beach and find beach chairs and cold drinks waiting for us. Then the first shell hit the water, maybe 50 yards to our left, and the explosion threw up a column of water that came down on us. Like rain, the illusion shattered, replaced by stark terror as the boat's engine roared louder and we surged forward with a dozen other craft, all of us racing toward that beach like we couldn't wait to reach it. The lieutenant was shouting something, but I could unhear him over the engine and the explosions and the sound of my own blood pounding in my ears. I saw his mouth moving, saw him pointing toward the beach, and I knew what he was saying, even if I couldn't hear it. Get ready. The water was rougher near shore, and our boat rose and fell like it was trying to shake us off. I gripped my rifle so hard my knuckles went white. Every muscle in my body tensed for impact. Beside me, Jenkins was muttering something under his breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe just counting, and his face had gone pale green. Peterson had his eyes closed, his lips moving silently. I wanted to close my eyes too, wanted to shut out the sight of that beach getting closer and closer, but I couldn't. I was transfixed by it, hypnotized by the shore that was about to become either our battlefield or our grave. The sun was starting to break over the horizon now, painting everything in shades of gold and red, and I thought about how wrong it was that something so beautiful could be the backdrop for something so terrible. The world should have gone dark for this. The sky should have turned black, and the ocean should have frozen solid, giving us a sign that what we were about to do was unnatural, was wrong. But instead, it was just another morning, and we were just men about to kill or be killed. The boat hit something, a sandbar maybe, or a rock, and we lurched forward, thrown against each other in a confused tangle of limbs and equipment. Before we could recover, the ramp dropped with a metallic screech that got through everything else. Light flooded in, blinding after the dimness of the boat's interior, and for a split second, nobody moved. We just stood there, blinking at the beach in front of us, at the sand and the smoke and the shapes moving in the distance that might have been men or might have been shadows. Then the lieutenant screamed, "Go! Go! Go!" And the spell broke. We poured out of that boat like water from a broken dam, our legs churning through water that was deeper than it looked, our boots filling with sand and stones. The weight of our packs tried to drag us down, but we pushed forward because going back wasn't an option. Behind us, more boats were hitting the beach, disgorging their own loads of frightened men. Around us, the water erupted with machine gun fire, the bullets making little fountains where they struck. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment, I was in the water, and the next I was on the sand, my legs pumping even though I couldn't feel them. My whole world narrowed down to the stretch of beach between me and the nearest cover. I saw Jenkins go down, saw him stumble and fall face first into the surf, and I started to turn back for him, but someone, Peterson maybe, or Carter, grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. We ran together, a group of maybe 5 or 6 of us, running toward a low concrete wall that looked like it might stop bullets. Explosions threw up geysers of sand and stone. Tracer rounds cut lines of light through the morning air. Somewhere, someone was screaming. A high, endless sound that could have been rage or pain or pure terror. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were made of lead. But I kept running because stopping meant dying. And when we finally threw ourselves behind that wall, gasping and shaking, I realized I was still alive and couldn't quite believe it. The sun was fully up now, bright and harsh, illuminating a beach that had turned into hell. And this, I understood with a clarity that cut through the fear and confusion, was only the beginning. We huddled behind that wall for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, trying to catch our breath and make sense of the chaos around us. The concrete was pitted and crumbling, barely tall enough to provide cover when we lay flat against it. Bullets smacked into the other side with sounds like rocks being thrown at a tin roof, sharp, irregular, relentless. Every impact made me flinch, made my body try to shrink into something smaller than human. Carter was bleeding from somewhere, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder, but he insisted he was fine, even as his face went gray. Peterson kept looking back, toward the water, toward where Jenkins had fallen, and I knew what he was thinking, because I was thinking it too. Should we have gone back? Could we have saved him? But there was no time for that kind of thinking. No space in this new world for second-guessing and what-ifs. The lieutenant appeared from somewhere, materializing out of the smoke like a ghost, and started shouting orders that barely made sense but gave us something to focus on besides our own terror. The French were supposed to welcome Mustats. What the briefing had said, the Vichy forces stationed here were French, and we were coming to liberate them from Nazi control, so they'd lay down their weapons and join us. That was the plan. But whoever wrote that briefing had never been shot at by French machine guns, had never watched French mortar rain down on American soldiers struggling through the surf. Either the intelligence was wrong, or someone had decided not to tell us the truth. And it didn't matter which, because the result was the same. We were pinned down on a beach, taking fire from soldiers who were supposed to be our allies, in a country we had no business being in, except that history and Hitler had decided otherwise. I thought about how strange it was, how absurd that I might die on an African beach killed by Frenchmen while fighting Germans. If I'd tried to explain it to my father, he would have thought I'd lost my mind. Hell, I was starting to think I'd lost my mind. The sergeant organized us into groups, and we started moving, leapfrogging forward from cover to cover, laying down suppressing fire while others advanced. It was a dance we'd practiced 100 times in training. But training had never included the smell of blood and gunpowder, had never included the weight of knowing that every decision might be your last. I found myself at the front of our group. Pressed against a low stone wall was Peterson on one side and a kid whose name I didn't know on the other. The sergeant was yelling for us to advance to a building about 30 yards ahead, a white structure with blue shutters that looked like it should have been on a postcard instead of a battlefield. I wanted to tell him it was too far, that we'd never make it, but before I could speak, he was up and running. And we were following, because that's what you did. You followed, even when it made no sense, even when every cell in your body was screaming at you to dig a hole and hide in it until the war was over. We made it to the building! Somehow, though I don't remember the actual running, just the sudden impact of my body hitting the wall and sliding down it, gasping for air that tasted like smoke and dust. 2 men didn't make it high. Saw them fall, saw their bodies jerk and collapse like puppets whose strings had been cut. But I didn't have time to see who they were before we were returning fire, shooting at muzzle flashes and shapes in windows across the street. My rifle kicked against my shoulder, the sound of it deafening even through the general roar of battle. I'd never shot at a person before, had only fired at targets on the range back home, and I found myself wondering if I'd hit anyone, if somewhere across that street someone was falling because of me. The thought should have horrified me, but all I felt was a strange numbness, like my emotions had been disconnected from my actions. I was just a body pulling a trigger, a machine doing what it had been programmed to do. The person I'd been before the kid, who'd worried about asking Emily to dance, who'd helped his mother with the dishes, who'd cried when his dog died, seemed like a character from a book I'd read long ago. The fighting went on and on, time stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. Sometimes it felt like hours passed between one heartbeat and the next, and sometimes entire battles seemed to happen in the space of a breath. We took the building we'd been ordered to take, then another, pushing forward street by street, house by house. The town Casablanca, I learned later, though at the time it was just a maze of white walls and blue doors and red tile roofs, became a labyrinth where death waited around every corner. We learned to read the streets like a language. A pile of rubble might hide a machine gun nest. A seemingly empty window might conceal a sniper. A quiet alley might be a killing zone. And slowly, painfully, we learned to become soldiers instead of boys playing dress-up in uniforms. Too big for our souls. I watched Peterson shoot a man off a rooftop and not even pause. Just move on to the next target like he'd done it 1,000 times. I watched Carter, still bleeding from his shoulder wound, drag a wounded French soldier to cover and bandage him with the same hands that had been trying to kill him minutes before. I watched myself do things I'd never imagined I was capable of, and I didn't know if I should be proud or ashamed. By the time night fell, we'd pushed far enough inland that the sound of fighting on the beach was just a distant rumble, like thunder from a storm that had already passed. We took shelter in a bombed-out school, its walls pockmarked, with bullet holes, and one whole corner collapsed into rubble. Someone found a classroom that still had most of its roof intact, and we collapsed there, too exhausted to even think about posting proper guards. The sergeant didn't argue with us about it, just nodded and took the first watch himself, sitting in the doorway with his rifle across his knees and staring out of the dark street like he expected the whole German army to come marching around the corner. The rest of us sprawled on the floor among overturned desks and scattered books, trying to convince our bodies that it was okay to relax, even though every nerve ending was still screaming danger. I found a child's notebook, the pages covered in careful French script grammar exercises, or a story, I couldn't tell which. The handwriting was precise, each letter formed with the kind of concentration that comes from trying to please a teacher or parent. I wondered where that child was now, if they'd escaped before the shooting started, or if they were huddled somewhere in the darkness, listening to foreign soldiers tear their city apart. I thought about the children who'd been in my own elementary school, tried to imagine armies fighting through those familiar hallways, and couldn't. It seemed impossible that the same world could contain my peaceful Ohio hometown in this shattered Moroccan city. But it was the same world, I realized, just different pieces of it, and the war was busy breaking down the walls between those pieces, whether we liked it or not. I set the notebook down carefully, like it was something precious, and felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it made my bones ache. Peterson sat next to me, his back against the wall, and neither of us spoke for a long time. What was there to say? Jenkins was dead. We'd learned that from a runner who'd come up from the beach with supplies and casualty reports. He'd been hit as soon as the ramp dropped, killed instantly, according to the official report. Though I remembered seeing him stumble and fall, and wondered if instant was just something they said to make everyone feel better. 3 others from our boat were dead too, and 5 more wounded badly enough to be of. Less than 12 hours ago, we'd all been together in that metal hold, all of us alive and whole and terrified in the same way. Now, some of us were gone, and the rest of us were changed into something we didn't have words for yet. Peterson finally spoke, his voice rough and quiet. "You think it gets easier?" I wanted to lie to him, wanted to say yes, but I couldn't make the word come out. Instead, I just shook my head, and we sat there in the dark, mourning for ourselves and for Jenkins, and for all the versions of ourselves that had died on that beach, even if our bodies were still breathing. Somewhere in the ruined school, someone started singing. It was just a whisper at first, barely audible, but gradually others joined in, until the sound filled the broken classroom. It was a hymn one I'd heard 1,000 times in church back home, but had never really listened to. Now, sung by voices roughened by smoke and shouting, it sounded differentless, like praise, and more like a question, a plea for meaning in a world that seemed to have lost all sense. I found myself singing too, the words coming automatically, even though my throat was tight and my eyes were burning. We sang like we were trying to remind ourselves that we were still human, still capable of creating something besides destruction. And for those few minutes, the war receded just far enough that I could remember who I'd been before, could imagine a future where I might be that person again. It was a lie, probably, but it was a necessary one. The kind of lie that keeps you going when the truth would paralyze you. The sergeant let us rest for a few hours, though he kept watch the whole time, his eyes never stopping their scan of the darkness beyond our shelter. When he finally woke us, the moon was high and the streets were silver and black and full of shadows that could have been anything. We had new orders: push further inland, link up with another unit, secure a crossroads that some general somewhere had decided was important. It all sounded abstract, meaningless, just words that would lead to more running and shooting and bleeding. But we checked our weapons and adjusted our gear and prepared to move out, because that's what soldiers do. We follow orders even when we don't understand them, even when following them might kill us, because the alternative is chaos, and we've all seen enough chaos to last several lifetimes. As we filed out into the Moroccan night, I took one last look at that classroom with its scattered books and tiny desks, and I said a silent prayer for the child who'd written in that notebook, hoped they were safe somewhere, hoped they'd grow up in a world that was better than this one. Then I turned my back on the school and followed the others into the darkness, because that's what the war demanded, and I didn't know how to refuse it anymore. The days blurred together after that first landing, each one a variation on the same theme of advance and fight. Dig in and wait, then advance again. We moved inland through countryside that would have been beautiful under different circumstances: rolling hills, covered in olive groves, small villages with whitewashed houses clustered around stone wells, markets that had been abandoned so quickly you could still see produce rotting on the stalls. But we saw it all through the lens of war, evaluating every hill for defensive positions, every village for ambush sites, every peaceful scene for the violence it might be hiding. The Vichy resistance had collapsed quickly after those first brutal days, and now we were pushing toward Tunisia, toward the real fight with Ramal's forces. The officers talked about momentum and strategic advantage, but all we cared about was that each day we survived was one day closer to going home, even though none of us believed we'd actually make it that far. I stopped writing letters after the third week. What was there to say that wouldn't be a lie? I couldn't tell my mother about watching Peterson shoot a German sniper out of a minaret. Couldn't describe to Emily the sound a man makes when he's dying from a stomach wound. Couldn't explain to my father why I'd stopped flinching at the sound of artillery because I'd heard it so often it had become like background music. The chaplain encouraged us to write anyway, said it would help keep us connected to home, to who we really were. But I didn't want to be connected to home anymore because that just made the present unbearable. It was easier to pretend that this was all there was, that I'd never been anything but a soldier trudging through African dust, that there was no Ohio town waiting for me and no girl wondering if I was okay. So I stopped writing, and I watched the others stop writing too, one by one, until our mail call got shorter and shorter and the chaplain stopped asking us about letters home. The landscape changed as we moved east, becoming more arid, more desolate. The November rains that had turned the beach landings into a muddy nightmare gave way to clear, cold nights and days so bright they hurt your eyes. We learned to wrap our faces against the dust that got into everything: our food, our water, our weapons, our lungs. We learned to sleep in slit trenches and shell holes, to brush scorpions out of our boots in the morning, to tell the difference between the sound of incoming fire and outgoing fire in less time than it takes to blink. We became efficient killers and even more efficient survivors, shedding everything that wasn't essential to those two skills. The weight we carried became physical rather than emotional. We could unafford feelings when every ounce of strength needed to go toward staying alive and keeping the man next to you alive. I stopped thinking of the enemy as people and started thinking of them as targets, problems to be solved with bullets and grenades. It was the only way to do the job without going insane. But there were moments when the humanity broke through, when the machine we'd turned ourselves into cracked just enough to let the light in. I remember finding a letter in a German soldier's pocket after a firefight, carefully folded and read so many times the creases were nearly torn through. It was in German, so I couldn't read the words, but I didn't need to. I recognized the handwriting as a woman's recognized the careful way it had been. Preserved as the act of someone trying to hold on to love in the middle of hell. I stood there in the dust, holding this dead man's letter, and for just a moment I saw him as someone's son, someone's husband or boyfriend, someone who'd probably been just as scared and confused and far from home as I was. Then Peterson called out that we were moving, and I dropped the letter and moved on, because there wasn't time for compassion in a war. But I thought about it that night, and many nights after, wondered what that letter had said, wondered if the woman who'd written it would ever know what happened to the man she'd sent it to. We celebrated Thanksgiving in a dried-up riverbed somewhere in Algeria, our feast consisting of cold rations and brackish water from our canteens. The sergeant tried to make a speech about what we had to be thankful for. We were alive. We were winning. We were doing something important, but his heart wasn't in it, and neither were ours. We ate in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about other Thanksgivings, about tables loaded with turkey and stuffing and pie, about families gathered together and giving thanks for blessings that seemed to belong to a different universe than this one. I thought about my mother's pumpkin pie, the way the kitchen would smell when she pulled it from the oven, the way my father would pretend he was too full but always found room for a second slice. I thought about Emily, wondered if she was having dinner with her family, if they'd set a place for me the way some families did for their boys overseas. And I thought about Jenkins, about how he'd never have another Thanksgiving, never get another chance to be thankful for anything. When the sergeant finally dismissed us, I walked away from the camp and stood looking at the stars, the same stars that were shining over Ohio, over Germany, over every battlefield and peaceful town in the world. They didn't care about our war, didn't even acknowledge it was happening, and somehow that was comforting, the idea that there were things bigger than this conflict, that the universe would keep spinning whether we won or lost, lived or died. December brought rain again, and with it a different kind of misery. The desert turned to mud that sucked at our boots and made every step an effort. Our uniforms never dried, and the cold got into our bones and stayed there, making us shiver even when we weren't scared, which wasn't often. We'd reached Tunisia now, and the fighting had intensified as Ramoles's forces dug in and decided to make us pay for every inch of ground. The war became less about dramatic advances and more about brutal, grinding attrition artillery duels that lasted for hours, snipers picking off anyone who showed their head, patrols that went out at night and sometimes didn't come back. The casualty lists grew longer, and we stopped learning the replacement soldiers' names because odds were they'd be dead or wounded before we got to know them anyway. It sounds callous, and maybe it was, but it was also survival you can only mourn so many times before your heart just stops registering the losses. I got promoted to corporal without asking for it or wanting it. The previous corporal had stepped on a mine, and suddenly I was responsible for 5 other men who looked at me like I had answers I didn't have. The sergeant said I'd do fine, that I'd proven myself, but I didn't feel proven. I felt like a fraud playing at leadership while people's lives hung in the balance. My squad became Peterson, Carter back from his shoulder wound, and 3 replacements so young they looked like they should still be in high school. I learned their names: Riley, Kowalski, and Martinez B. 'Cause I had to, because not knowing seemed like a betrayal of the responsibility I'd been given, and I tried to keep them alive while also accomplishing whatever mission some officer somewhere had decided was worth dying for. We took a hill on Christmas Eve, a strategic nothing that some general had marked on a map and decided we needed. The Germans had fortified it with machine gun nests and mortar positions, and they made us pay for every yard. Riley died halfway up, shot through the chest while trying to lay down covering fire. I saw him fall, saw him roll back down the slope we'd just climbed, but I couldn't stop to help him because stopping would have gotten everyone else killed. So I kept moving forward, kept shouting orders that probably made no sense, kept firing my weapon at shadows and flashes until suddenly we were at the top and the Germans were retreating and the hill was ours. The victory felt hollow, meaningless. We'd gained a piece of high ground that would look good on a map and cost us 2 dead and 3 wounded for a position we'd probably abandon in a week. I sat on the crest of that hill and watched the sun set over Tunisia, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that should have been beautiful, but just reminded me that Riley would never see another sunset, that he'd died before he'd even turned 20, that his parents would get a telegram and his girlfriend would get a return letter, and none of it would mean a damn thing. That night, someone had smuggled a bottle of wine through the supply chain, and we passed it around, taking small sips that warmed our throats and loosened our tongues. Carter started talking about his kid sister's Christmas pageant, how she was supposed to be an angel but had fallen off the stage during rehearsal and broken her arm. Peterson reminisced about Christmas morning traditions, about how his family always had pancakes shaped like snowmen, Martinez described midnight mass in his grandmother's village in Mexico, the church lit by what seemed like 1,000 candles. And I told them about building snowmen with my father, about how we'd always put a carrot nose on crooked, just to make my mother laugh. We sat there on that meaningless hill, passing around stolen wine and sharing memories of Christmases past, trying to remind ourselves that we'd once been people who celebrated holidays instead of counting days survived. It was the closest we'd come to marking the holiday, and it was enough not because it was joyful, but because it was human, because for a few minutes we weren't soldiers, but just guys talking about home. The next morning, we buried Riley in a temporary cemetery that was rapidly filling up with temporary graves. The chaplain said words about sacrifice and honor and serving a higher purpose, and maybe he believed them, but I couldn't anymore. Riley had been a kid from Tennessee who'd wanted to be a teacher, who'd shown me pictures of his dog and talked about how he could unwait to get home and take it hunting. He had died for honor or higher purposes. He died because a piece of metal traveled faster than sound had intersected with the space his body occupied, because war is random and cruel and doesn't care about your dreams or plans. But I stood at attention and saluted when they lowered him into the ground, because that's what you did, because ritual was all we had left to impose meaning on the meaningless. And then we shouldered our rifles and marched away from that cemetery, leaving Riley behind with all the other temporary graves that would probably be forgotten once the war moved on and the locals reclaimed their land. The hill we'd taken looked like all the other hills around it, indistinguishable and insignificant, but it had cost us Riley, and that made it important in a way no strategic value ever could. We'd marked it with blood, which was the only kind of marking that seemed to matter anymore. By the time February arrived, we were veterans in a way that had nothing to do with time served, and everything to do with what we'd seen and done. The wide-eyed boys who'd landed on that beach in November were gone, replaced by men who could sleep through artillery barrages and eat breakfast next to yesterday's battlefield without flinching. We'd learned the language of war, the vocabulary of kill zones and fields of fire, the grammar of advance and retreat, the punctuation of gunfire that ended sentences and lives. We moved through the Tunisian countryside like ghosts, efficient and deadly, no longer questioning orders or wondering why, just executing missions and counting the hours until we could rest. Peterson barely spoke anymore, his eyes gone flat and distant. Carter had started talking to himself when he thought no one was listening. Martinez prayed constantly, his lips moving in silent conversation with a god who seemed to have abandoned this part of the world. And I just felt numb, hollowed out, like someone had reached inside me and removed everything that made me recognizably human. The Germans were fighting harder now, their backs against the wall as we squeezed them between American forces pushing from the west and British forces advancing from the east. Every engagement was desperate, both sides knowing that this was it, that Tunisia would be the end of one army or the other. We took casualties. Kowalski lost a leg to a mine. Carter finally got hit badly enough that they evacuated him home. Peterson caught shrapnel from a grenade that should have killed him but somehow didn't. Replacements came and went, their names blurring together into a collective identity of young, scared, and usually I tried to keep my squad alive while also accomplishing the missions, but it felt increasingly like I was just delaying the inevitable, that we were all marked for death, and it was just a matter of when, not if. The sergeant seemed to have aged a decade in those few months, his face lined and gray, his movements slower, more careful. He'd started making mistakes, small ones, that could have gotten people killed if we hadn't caught them. But none of us said anything because we were all making mistakes, all coming apart at the seams, while trying to hold ourselves together long enough to see the storms that turned the world orange and reduced visibility to nothing. We hunkered down during the worst of them, wrapping our faces and trying not to breathe too deeply as the wind screamed and the sand scoured everything it touched. During one particularly bad storm, I found myself sharing a shell hole with a replacement whose name I thought was Davis or Davies or something like that. He was crying great silent sobs that shook his whole body, and I realized he was just a kid, couldn't have been more than 18. Looking for some comfort or reassurance or explanation, I wanted to tell him it would be okay, wanted to say something comforting, but I couldn't force the lie past my lips. Instead, I just put my hand on his shoulder and let him cry, because sometimes that's all you can offer, the simple acknowledgement that someone sees your pain even if they can't do anything about it. When the storm passed, we climbed out of that hole and kept moving, the kid with his red eyes and me with my inability to offer hope. 2 days later, he died in an ambush, and I couldn't even remember if his name had been Davis or Davies, and that felt like the worst failure of all. But we kept pushing forward, because that's what wars do. They grind forward, regardless of individual suffering. By April, the German forces were collapsing, their supply lines cut, their ammunition running low, their soldiers exhausted and demoralized. We could smell victory coming, that strange mixture of relief and the feeling of realizing you've survived something you thought would kill you, but finding no joy in that survival. The final battles were fierce but short, last stands by men who knew they'd lost but fought anyway, because surrendering felt like admitting it had all been for nothing. I understood that feeling better than I wanted to admit the desire to keep fighting, even when fighting was pointless, because stopping meant having to face what you'd become, what you'd done, who you'd lost along the way. When the last German forces in North Africa surrendered in May, we didn't celebrate, we just sat down right where we were, too exhausted to feel anything like triumph. 7 months had passed since we'd hit those beaches in Morocco, and it felt like 7 lifetimes. I looked at what was left of my squad Peterson, with his distant eyes and new scars. Martinez praying to his unresponsive God, and 2 replacements who somehow survived long enough to almost seem like they belonged, and I couldn't find it in myself to tell them we'd won. We'd survived, which wasn't the same thing at all. The officers talked about the significance of our victory, about how we'd driven the Axis out of Africa, about how this was the beginning of the end. But sitting there in the Tunisian dust, all I could think about was Jenkins and Riley and Kowalski and Carter and Davies and all the others whose names I'd forgotten or never learned, and how they'd never know that we'd won, that their sacrifices had meant something in the grand calculus of history. I thought about how my mother would get a letter saying I was okay, and Emily would cry with relief, and my father would tell everyone at the factory that his son was a hero. And I thought about how none of them would ever understand what had happened to the person they sent away, how the boy who'd left. Ohio no longer existed, replaced by this hollow thing that wore his face and carried his memories, but felt like a stranger even to himself. The war moved on without us for a while. After Tunisia fell, they pulled us back for rest and refitting, which meant we got to sleep in actual tents instead of foxholes and eat hot food instead of cold rations. It should have felt like a vacation, but none of us could relax. We'd spent so long in a state of constant vigilance that peace felt wrong, dangerous, like something terrible was about to happen. I'd wake up at night in a panic, reaching for a rifle that was leaning against my cot instead of cradled in my arms, convinced I'd heard incoming fire, when it was just someone snoring. Peterson barely slept at all, just walked the camp perimeter all night like he was still on patrol. Martinez's prayers got longer and more desperate, like he was trying to bargain with God for his soul, and I found myself unable to write the letters I knew I should write, unable to bridge the gap between the world of war and the world of home, unable to pretend they were the same universe. They brought in a psychiatrist to talk to us about what they were calling combat fatigue. He was a kind man with gentle eyes who'd never been closer to combat than a training film, and he asked us questions about how we were sleeping. If we had nightmares, if we thought about death, we answered the way we'd learned to answer offers. Tell them what they want to hear. Keep the truth buried where it can get us sent somewhere worse than the front. Yes, sir. Sleeping fine, sir. Just regular war dreams, sir. Nothing to worry about, sir. He seemed satisfied with our lies, wrote something in his notebook, and told us we were resilient, that we were coping well with the stress of combat. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that we weren't coping, we were just continuing. Momentum carrying us forward because we'd forgotten how to be still. The war had turned us into sharks that had to keep swimming or die, and now they wanted us to be goldfish in a bowl, peaceful and placid and content with circular swimming. But you can't go back to being a goldfish once you've tasted blood in the ocean. I finally wrote a letter home, though it took me 3 days to finish it. I told them I was fine, that the food was decent, that I'd made good friends. I told them about the weather and the countryside, describing Tunisia like it was some exotic vacation destination instead of the place where I'd watched men die and killed men myself. I told them I missed them, which was true, and that I'd be home soon, which I hoped was true, and that they shouldn't worry, which was a lie. What I didn't tell them was that I woke up every morning, surprised to still be alive, that I couldn't remember what Emily's face looked like anymore, that I'd stopped being able to feel much of anything except the vague sense of waiting for the next bad thing to happen. I signed it to your loving son and sealed it quickly before I could change my mind, before I could write what I really wanted to say. I am lost, and I do want to know how to find my way back to you. I am scared that even if my body makes it home, the rest of me will stay here forever. I not know who I am anymore without a rifle in my hands, and people trying to kill me. But you don't write those things in letters home. So I kept them locked inside, where they gnawed at me like something alive and hungry. The orders came in June. We were shipping out for Sicily, the next step in the campaign to take back Europe. Part of me felt relief, at least in combat. I knew who I was, knew what I was supposed to do. Here in the rest camp, I was just a ghost haunting a body, going through motions that felt increasingly meaningless. But another part of me, the part that still remembered being human, felt a deep bone-tired despair at the thought of doing it all. Again, the fear, the violence, the watching friends die, the becoming something monstrous in order to survive. I looked at Peterson and Martinez and the others, and I saw that same despair reflected in their eyes. We were being asked to march back into hell after barely escaping it the first time, and we didn't have the strength to refuse, even though every instinct screamed at us to run, to hide, to find some way out of the machine that was grinding us down into nothing. But we were soldiers, which meant we didn't get to choose. So we cleaned our rifles and checked our equipment and prepared to do it all over again, because that is what the war demanded, and we'd long since lost the ability to tell it no. The night before we shipped out, I walked away from the camp and found a quiet spot on a hillside overlooking the Mediterranean. The moon was full, painting the water silver, and I could almost pretend I was somewhere peaceful, somewhere the war hadn't touched. I thought about all the distance we'd covered since November, the beaches and towns and hills and deserts, each one purchased with blood and fear and pieces of our humanity. I thought about Jenkins dying in the surf, and Riley falling on that Christmas Eve hill, and all the others who started this journey with us but would never finish it. And I thought about the ones who'd survived, about how we were still here, but not really, about how the war had killed us in ways that didn't show up on casualty reports. I wanted to cry, wanted to rage, wanted to feel something sharp and real that would prove I was still capable of emotion. But there was just emptiness, just the hollow place where my feelings used to be. So I sat there on that hillside until the sun started to rise, watching the light chase the darkness off the water, and I made myself a promise. If I survived this war, if I somehow made it home, I would spend the rest of my life trying to remember who I'd been before. All this trying to honor the memory of that boy from Ohio who believed in glory and duty and doing the right thing. It was a small promise, maybe a futile one, but it was all I had to hold on to as I walked back down that hill toward whatever fresh hell awaited us across the water. If you're reading this, then I made it home. Or maybe I didn't, and someone found this account among my things and decided it should be shared. Either way, it doesn't matter much. The story isn't really about whether I survived, but about what survival costs and what it meant for all of us who lived through those 7 months in North Africa. We were just boys playing at being soldiers, and the war made us into something else entirely. Something we didn't have words for and didn't want to examine too closely. We did terrible things and had terrible things done to us, and we called it duty and honor and necessary evil. But mostly it was just survival and fear and the desperate hope that there would be something left of us when it was all over. The history books will tell you about Operation Torch, about how we invaded North Africa and drove out the Axis forces and opened up the Mediterranean and paved the way for the invasion of Sicily and eventually Europe. They talk about strategic objectives and commanding officers and the political implications of Vichy France and Free France and all the complex international relationships that shaped the campaign. They'll give you casualty figures and battle statistics and maps with arrows showing troop movements, and all of it will be true and accurate and completely meaningless because it won't tell you what it was actually like to be there, to be 20 years old and terrified and so far from home that home started to seem like a dream you once had but don't quite remember. The numbers won't tell you about the smell of cordite and blood, about the sound of someone calling for their mother as they died, about the weight of carrying a friend's dog tags because his body had been blown into too many pieces to recover. The maps won't show you the interior landscape we traveled through, the journey from innocence to experience, from boys to whatever it was we became, from belief in glory to the understanding that there is no glory in war, just survival and loss, and the hope that the reasons we fought might somehow justify what we became in the fighting. I carried the weight of that campaign with me for the rest of my life, and so did all of us who survived it. We came home to parades and medals and people who called us heroes, but we didn't feel like heroes. We felt like we'd gotten away with something, like we'd cheated death while better men had died, and no amount of celebration could shake that fundamental sense of guilt and unworthiness. We tried to go back to normal lives, jobs and marriages and raising children, but the war never really left us. It lived in our nightmares and our startle reflexes, in the way we couldn't stand to be in crowds or handle sudden loud noises, in the silences that fell over us when someone asked about our service and we tried to find sanitized words for unspeakable experiences. Some of us made it work, found ways to integrate what we'd been through into who we became. Others never managed the transition, lost to alcohol or anger or just a slow fade into isolation and depression. But all of us carried it, that knowledge of what humans can do to each other, what we can become when the thin veneer of civilization gets stripped away and we re-reduced to our most basic imperatives of survival and dominance. If there's anything I want people to understand from this account, it's that war isn't glorious or heroic or even particularly meaningful most of the time. It's just waste of lives and potential and innocence. Waste of all the things those young men could have been if they'd been allowed to grow old in peace. Every time I hear someone glorify war, or talk about how it builds character, or makes men out of boys, I want to scream at them that they don't understand what they're saying, that they're romanticizing something that should be seen as the absolute last resort, the failure of every better option. War doesn't make men out of boys, it makes ghosts out of both, hollow things that walk around in the shapes of people but have had their humanity scraped away by violence and fear. The boys who landed on those African beaches in November 1942 never came home. Not really. We left them there in the sand and the dust and the mud, along with our capacity for innocence and our belief that the world was fundamentally good and made sense. What came home instead were survivors, men who'd learned to live with what they'd done and seen, who'd found ways to function despite the weight of all that loss and horror. And we spent the rest of our lives mourning for those boys. We'd been for the futures they might have had if history had decided to spend them, purchasing strategic objectives in a North African campaign that most people do uneven remember anymore. This is not just history. This is memory, testimony, the last words of men who can't speak for themselves anymore. If this account has moved you, if it has made you think differently about war or sacrifice or the cost of the freedoms we enjoy, then don't let it end here. Share this story. Talk about it. Remember that behind every strategic, objective, and casualty statistic were real people with dreams and fears, and families waiting for them. Honor their memory not with empty platitudes about glory and heroism, but with honest acknowledgement of what they endured and what it cost them. And most importantly, remember that war should always be the last resort, chosen only when every other option has failed. Because the price of war is paid not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the souls of the young men and women we send to do the fighting. They come back changed, if they come back at all. And we owe them our commitment to making sure their sacrifices meant something, that we build a world that justifies what they gave up to defend it. Never forget. Never stop questioning whether the objectives are worth the cost. Never let war become normal or acceptable or just another policy option. The boys who died in North Africa deserve at least that much. From Astat, we remember what they paid and refused to spend such currency cheaply. Their stories, their sacrifices, their transformation from innocent boys into haunted survivors. This is the true cost of war, and it's a debt we can never fully repay. But we can honor it by refusing to forget, by telling these stories to the next generation, by making sure that when we do send our children to war, we do so with full knowledge of what we're asking them to give up. That's the legacy of Operation Torch and every other campaign at victory or defeat, but the reminder that war devours the best of us and leaves only shadows in its wake.